Great. Thank you all so much for joining this evening. I have two colleagues with me to go through some Oxbridge mock interviews in a couple of different subject areas. We'll be providing a little bit of commentary around them, a little bit of feedback on each of them. So hopefully this next hour or so is going to help you get familiar with the sorts of questions that come up in Oxford and Cambridge interviews. And also you'll have a chance to ask questions after the session has finished. You'll be taken to a questionnaire that's run through Zoom, and you can put in your questions, your comments, so that we can get back to you after this webinar. Brilliant. So I think because we've got quite a bit to get through, I am going to get started. So we are Oxbridge Applications, and this is about Oxbridge interviews. Who is Oxbridge Applications? So we advise on applications to Oxford and Cambridge universities, among other competitive universities in the UK. Why Oxford and Cambridge? Because simply there's more hurdles to jump over. There's interviews, there's tests. Lots of you will have taken those recently. Congratulations if you have done. And we've been around for a while, so over 25 years old now. We're all Oxford and Cambridge graduate staff, and our tutor network is also made up of Oxford and Cambridge graduates and former admissions tutors across all the different subjects available. And if you're interested in booking some mock interviews with us, I wanted to make you aware right away that we're offering everyone watching this a 10% discount from any mock interview packages. So if you'd like to avail that discount, I'm going to show that again towards the end. We'll send it to you afterwards as well, but that is webinar 0511. Who have we got presenting today? So first of all, it's Alison. Let me hand over to Alison.
Thank you so much. My name's Alison. I have had the pleasure of working with Oxbridge Applications for the last 10 years. My background is in maths and philosophy at Oxford, not history and English, which is a bit of an Easter egg for later in today's webinar, but it's really lovely to see everybody today.
Thank you very much. My name's Theo, so I've presented a couple of these webinars before. You might have been at the last webinar I was at. I went to Queen's College, Cambridge. I studied Human Social Political Sciences, or HSPS, and then studied a postgrad in psychology and neuroscience, and I'm representing the social science side of things today.
Hi guys, I'm Tom and I lead the consultancy team at Oxbridge Applications, and basically that means I exist to meet students, meet families, talk to them about their applications, strategizing them, and what it also means is I probably do about 500 mock interviews with students every year. So hopefully that's helpful today. And I studied, as it says there, English at Downing College, Cambridge, and I'm here kind of to represent the humanities side of everything this evening.
Thanks, Tom. That's a really good point. Each of us have mock interviewed hundreds and hundreds of applicants across lots of different subjects over the years. So we bring quite a lot of experience. So what's the plan? Today, we're going to do a 2-minute quick refresher of what interviews are, why they're used for Oxford and Cambridge, the sort of format to expect, the kinds of things that you would typically cover. And then we're going to jump into 3 different mock interviews. So the first one will be a humanities and arts subject, history and English. We're going to run that live. After each of these, we'll go through a little bit of feedback. So each of us will say what we think was good and what we think could be improved. Then over the last couple of days, we've recorded a couple of mock interviews in different subjects. So I'll be playing an extract from our physical natural sciences mock interview, followed by a bit of feedback. And then finally, an extract from our law mock interview, followed by a bit of feedback. Both the physical natural sciences and the law interviews are longer than the versions I have time to show you today. So we'll send you the full links to watch at your leisure if you want to see the whole thing. Then we'll finish off with a few top tips so that you can keep preparing in the next few weeks. So without further ado, I think we can get on with the refresher. So what does an Oxbridge interview look like? You may have already had a mock interview. You may have seen interviews being done as demonstrations from Oxford or Cambridge online. They're usually 20 to 30 minutes long. Occasionally, you have a longer interview. I just had one interview that was 45 minutes long, but in most cases, you have two interviews around 25 minutes each. The majority of you will have your interviews online. For Oxford, all interviews are online. For Cambridge, about 75% of interviews are online. Some colleges are giving students the choice at Cambridge whether they want to come in person or not. And for some subjects, they'll ask students if you're based in the UK to come in person. You should know already if that will apply to you. If not, it's worth checking on your own Cambridge College website whether they'll be interviewing in person or not this year. Each interview is typically led by two academics. One takes the lead with questions, and then the other one is there to moderate or take notes. Sometimes each of them will ask a few questions. And so overall, you'll be seen by 4 or sometimes more than 4 academics in total. So usually 2 interviews, which means about 45 minutes to an hour's total interview time. And they're all happening in December. Some years you might have 1 or 2 interviews creeping just on the tail end of November, but the majority of interviews will be throughout December. You might be able to see already the schedule of interviews depending on what subject you're applying for. At Oxford, they tend to schedule these according to subject, whereas at Cambridge, it very much depends on the college that you've applied to. And what can you expect to discuss? Well, you're about to see the sorts of things that you're going to be discussing. But remember, you will have submitted quite a lot of information about yourself to each of these universities, depending on which you apply to. So they have your personal statement. They have what your school is saying about you. They may also have your additional personal statement if you've applied to Cambridge. In the majority of interviews at Oxford and Cambridge, it's not guaranteed. So it may not come up. They will want to ask you something from what you've submitted. So it could be a detail in your personal statement. It could be a book that you've mentioned. It could even be about a hobby that you say you've done. And what could they ask you? It's really hard to predict, but one quite helpful exercise is to go through everything that you've submitted. By the way, that includes any essays that you've needed to submit, and put a little question mark at the end of each sentence and each point and each thought, as if you're an admissions tutor reading it. So what extra detail could you give about that particular book or resource or article or study? And with submitted work, if you're applying for an essay subject, that could equally be asked about. So please make sure you reread your essays before you turn up for your interviews online if you're going for an essay-based subject. I did, and I was asked about my essays, and I hadn't read them for about a month before because I wasn't expecting them to come up. So it's definitely a good idea to cover them. So your motivation, why are you applying to study this course? Secondly, debates/problems related to your chosen course. So it could be that you're applying for a course which is really problem-based. So with STEM subjects, for example, you'll be doing things like mathematical problems, maybe lab reports, problem solving constantly through your degree. And so you could wager that a part of your interview will be based around doing some sorts of problems, and you'll see that in the physical natural sciences interview that I'll show you. Debates as well are very common to get into. So you might be asked difficult kind of complex questions about the nature of the course that you've applied for. And these are really getting at not how much knowledge do you have about this subject already, but what's your potential to do really well as an undergraduate student on this course. So what kinds of signs are you showing that you could succeed, get a 2-1 degree, potentially even a first-class degree, if you were to be admitted onto this particular course? Third, what's really common is to be shown objects during or shortly prior to your interview. By objects, I don't necessarily mean physical things like this Coke can. I mean, it could be texts, it could be graphs, it could be a video, it could be an image, a resource which is relevant to the course that you've chosen, which allows them to see what you'd be like when you're shown something new as part of the undergraduate degree. So, which you'll be frequently doing. If you're given a brand new set of research articles to go through for an essay about a topic you've never studied before, will you be persevering through them and grappling with that content and trying to make sense of it on your own without much support around you? Because after all, university study requires a lot more independent comprehension, and you won't be handheld through a lot of the material. So objects, you could be given a piece of text shortly before your interview, 30 or 40 minutes before, or you could be shown something live, which you'll see shortly. And like I mentioned about your motivation, anything you have submitted. So that goes back to your personal statement, your Cambridge additional statement, if you've written one, and any essays that you've submitted. Please make sure that you go back through them and that you're comfortable talking about them. Remind yourself what you argued, a couple of the details. They're not expecting you to memorize these essays, but it's good just to remember the main thrust of why you made the argument that you did. So that's a very short overview of Oxbridge interviews. If you want to go a bit more into depth, then I would recommend you go back to our previous webinar where I go into all the details about the different types of questions that come up. But now I'd love to hand over to Tom, who is going to be our interviewer for this first interview in history and English, which is a course you can apply for at Oxford. So this should give you a good idea about what arts and humanities interviews are like. So Tom.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I should also begin by thanking Alison, who is a STEM graduate, for very kindly volunteering to kind of perform the role of kind of nervous 17-year-old humanities applicant for the purposes of this demonstration. So as Theo says, History and English is a pretty niche course available at Oxford. And basically we've chosen it as it gives us a chance to interview on both the history and the English side of things. So cover a lot of breadth fairly quickly. I should note that usually for the course you'd be given separate history and English interviews, but we're going to switch it up a little bit today to cover both sides fairly quickly. And we've got about 20 minutes to do that. So we'll try to cover both the history and the English sides of what an interview for either of those subjects, or indeed both in combination, might look like. And then we'll do a few minutes of feedback. So before we kick off, I should just check that Alison can hear me, that all the audio is working, and that we're ready to go.
Okay.
Excellent. So if we can just click on to the next slide, what I'm quite keen to do is basically throw Alison in at the deep end. So what we've got in front of us now is a graph, and I'm literally going to give you, Alison, no further context, no further information. I'm just going to give you a little bit of time to gather your thoughts. And then what I want you to start doing, as and when you're ready, is begin talking to me about what you find interesting on screen in front of you.
Okay. Play along with hope. Okay, so what I'm seeing here is a graph showing GDP per capita. So we're controlling for population. We're looking at, I guess, relative economic richness, GDP being defined as the monetary value of goods and services produced by the area. And I look at the graph on the x-axis, I see the time period is steady, linear, and then GDP, the scale, I guess looks a bit odd.
Okay. Odd how?
Between the numbers are not even, and the numbers themselves are escalating quite a lot at the top, which means that steep, that hockey stick shape actually gets a lot steeper, so that the GDP really runs away and sort of, I would guess, but post-industrial revolution. I don't know what Geary Camis dollars are.
Okay, that's fine. So those are just dollars that are basically benchmarked against prices, in this case in the US, at a certain point in time. So usually benchmarked against the value or purchasing power of a dollar in the US in the year 2000. So it's just trying to keep everything relatively constant.
Okay, so this takes account of inflation and the value of money.
Yes, exactly. So as near as we can make it out.
So does this mean, does it have a relationship to the quality of life of these societies?
It could do. So as you've defined already, then GDP talks about the total value of the goods and services produced in a given economy, in this case on a per capita basis. Might there be a correlation between that and quality of life?
I think it's also bringing in, outside knowledge of technological advancements, and I can fully interpret it from this graph. The groupings of countries, I'm not sure what Western offshoots are.
Okay. Can you make a guess based on the context or based on the other kind of grouped units we've got?
We've got broad continents here, but not always. We've got former USSR. I guess we're grouping them around some kind of economic consistency. So, are these geographic areas grouped together because they are showing the same economic pattern and more or less the same geographically? Western offshoots, perhaps countries that are connected to, I think really of, I'm not sure.
Okay. So what might you be able to infer about those Western offshoots? So kind of, I will tell you that Western offshoots, it is a group of countries. What might you be able to infer about them from the data we have about them?
They've become the most productive, the biggest GDP in recent times. They were lagging behind in around 17th century or yeah, 18th century.
Okay, excellent. And if I then tell you that the Western offshoots grouping would include countries like or countries now like the United States, like Canada, like Australia, New Zealand, and so on, does that make sense? And does that square with what you've been thinking?
Makes a lot of sense. And they also aren't covered elsewhere.
Okay. Let's think a little bit about the kind of the data we have in front of us, kind of in a zoomed out sense. Do we think this is a helpful graph or a helpful data set? If we are a historian, what's interesting about it? Is it helpful to us, kind of our task of studying and understanding the past more accurately?
I would question what data we have for economic activity going back so far, and also covering the globe. I think there is inconsistency in terms of the historic record, which might call some of these. I think that there's probably quite a lot of assumption in there. And if I were a mathematician, which of course I'm not, I might comment on this inconsistent scale, perhaps coloring some of the meaning here. But I do think there's probably significance behind the geographic groupings. At the same time, Asia as a grouping will presumably include quite diverse economies that are growing at different rates. So I think you do lose some of the nuance.
Okay, good. So what limitations? So one of the things you mentioned earlier on in that response was the limitations we might have within this data set in terms of gathering accurate information to then plot on a graph. What limitations might a historian encounter in terms of trying to gather the right data to input here?
That our economies are very, very different, and applying modern standards to historic societies and historic economies. Our economy today, if we look at the UK economy, is made up of all sorts of interesting services and goods that wouldn't have existed. And historically, economies are perhaps more straightforward, much more localized, harder to track, without records. So a lot of it would be based on estimating the amount of economic activity going on without records.
Mm, absolutely. And so is it just guesswork that we have in terms of, say, looking at GDPR, GDP data, or estimating GDP data prior to, say, the turn of the 20th century?
No, I think as long as taxes have existed, there will be something that we can glean about productivity. Maybe we could be looking at um, historic records about adjacent data like population sizes, what we know of, perhaps going back to what we know of quality of life, perhaps, and how
Hmm.
much economic activity would happen in a particular society.
Yeah, and you mentioned taxes there as well. Great. What sort of taxes might we be looking at?
Taxes on businesses, of course, taxes on workers. Um, I'm thinking about the other taxes that existed historically that were often around property, but I don't know if that would give us a signal as to a country's GDP, but it wouldn't give us a total accurate picture. We
Hmm.
wanted to interpret economic activity.
What tax records might give us the most accurate picture or a less accurate picture? What are good taxes for us to be looking for records of?
VAT equivalent,
It could be a VAT equivalent.
business profit tax or income tax,
Okay. Why
looking
might
at
income tax
participation
be a
in the
particularly good one?
workforce, because we'll be able to see levels of participation in the workforce and how much money is transferred from businesses to workers. Would it be a good one because perhaps that is a record that we have um, going back many centuries. There's more
Okay.
reliable data.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then just to finish up then, if we move on to another piece of source material, are there any conclusions that you might draw from this graph that you find particularly interesting? Anything that you find striking and that you might want to investigate further?
I would want to look at the fact that each of these areas shows this same upward trend. It's a very dramatic upward trend. There is a degree of overtaking. So, like the Western offshoots is a good example of one which moves ranking. Um, but at the same time, I think it's notable that we're looking at a scale which is logarithmic. And if we look at 2000, there is huge disparity in the GDPs of these geographic areas.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so let's pause there on the history side of things. And if we click on to the next slide, then we can pivot over to a piece of source material for English. So in front of you, you can hopefully now see a poem. And some people get really existential about this, but I'm very happy to confirm it is a poem. And what I'm going to do is just give you about 60 seconds to read through it, so about a minute to read through it in your own time. So just get a sense of what's on the page or on the screen in front of you. And then when you're ready, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to read through it out loud. So you have a sense of the poem at a normal human spoken pace. And then we're going to spend a few minutes discussing it. Okay, so I'll give you about a minute to start with, just to get a sense of what's there. Then I'll prompt you to, in your own time, read it out loud. Okay. Have you had enough time, Alison, just to read through what's in front of you? Awesome. That's great. Okay, so in your own time, feel free to read out loud.
About suffering, they were never wrong. The old masters, how well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking duly along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of the wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot, where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. Its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruhl's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away, quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash with the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone as it had to go on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on.
Okay, thank you so much. So perhaps the first thing to ask is, do you like it?
I very much like it because the imagery, I think, makes a very effective point, and there's a combination of informal, colloquial doggy life with some
Hmm,
quite stark imagery and also classical references.
okay, excellent. So you mentioned first the imagery there. What point is the imagery trying to make?
Is I think it's illustrating comparison between the reality of suffering and um, I'm interpreting it as a poem about suffering, and whilst other people carelessly, carefree, continue with their lives, and the existence of those two things at once.
Hmm. So is it a poem about suffering, or is it a little bit more specific than that?
It's not about suffering.
Okay,
Is it
that's fine.
more specific?
Hmm.
Is it about a specific instance of suffering?
Okay. Well, let's see if we can just unpack that a little bit further then. So perhaps the key phrase to unlocking the major conceit of the poem is this phrase in the second line, the old masters. So who do we think the old masters might be?
Artists?
Okay, good, excellent. So the old masters, they are painters. What do you think's happening in the poem then? So if there is, we don't want to necessarily presuppose this, but if there is a plot to the poem, what's happening in it?
The artists are portraying suffering
Mm-hmm. Good.
at the same time as life goes on.
Good, absolutely. And what's the relation, as near as we can make it out, of the speaker of the poem, so the voice of the poem, to these artists?
Um, I'm not sure.
Okay, that's fine. So the major conceit of the poem is that basically the speaker, in this case the poet and the speaker are functionally one and the same, is walking around an art gallery, in this case an art gallery in Belgium, and looking at paintings on the wall and just kind of jotting down their thoughts about those paintings. Okay,
Oh, which
so that's the
explains the
hmm,
variety.
okay. Does it make you think about or look at the poem in a slightly different way, or does that kind of chime consistently with what you've been thinking about it?
I didn't quite work out why we were dotting around so much, and I couldn't find the through line of it. And the poetry was very very poetic. A lot of symbols that didn't feel familiar altogether.
Okay. So there's a potentially slightly disjointed quality there. Okay. If we look at or think about the poem structurally, so it's divided into two parts. We've got two stanzas in front of us. Why might we think the poem is broken where it is?
In two different rooms of the gallery.
Almost. Can you stretch a little bit further? It's literal, it's a physical reason.
Exhibitions.
Kind of, yeah. So we've got the first stanza where basically this guy is wandering around the art gallery, kind of jotting down brief thoughts about a series of unnamed paintings. And then suddenly in the second stanza, like we have, as you said, entered a completely different room, we are locked in front of a single painting. So Bruegel's Bruegel, the artist, his depiction of Icarus, the painting itself is called Landscape with a Fall of Icarus. And that's the subject of the second stanza. So that's perhaps the pivot we have. And if we click very briefly onto the next slide for a moment, then hopefully what we can see is that painting. So this is Bruegel's depiction of a landscape with the fall of Icarus, and you might be able to see in the middle of the frame, the ploughman. You can see what the poet describes as the expensive, delicate ship to the right of the frame. And then just below the stern of that ship, you can see Icarus's legs disappearing into the green water as he goes to the sun, falls into the sea, and drowns. So that's the painting that is, at least in theory, being depicted in the second stanza. Does the painting square with the impression you had of the second stanza?
Yes, I think it's given an importance in the second stanza, as though I now can see that the poet is absorbed by one thing, perhaps moving fleetingly through a gallery and being moved by one work.
Okay. Why this work in particular?
Is it embodying something that the poet has connected to the previous paintings?
Absolutely, it's the kind of arguably the ultimate encapsulation of the center point of the poem, the kind of the dislocation of suffering. So if we then just very briefly go back to the poem, and just want to give you a few seconds if you wanted to make any further observations before we finish up. Is there anything else that you didn't have a chance to comment on, that you found interesting or striking, or that you wanted to just discuss briefly?
No, I really wish that I could. I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, that's fine. So let's stop there. No further questions, or at least no further academic questions. And just very briefly to summarize, so that's one thing to note in terms of kind of format of interviews, that a lot of humanities and social sciences interviews are based on unseen source material. One of the reasons I was quite keen to kind of throw Alison in the deep end there, and it was quite cruel to Alison, is to just give a sense of how tight the time frame of the real interview is. A lot of the interviews, so all of the Oxford interviews and about half to 2/3 of the Cambridge interviews, are still online. You can literally log into a Zoom call. The interviewers will very briefly introduce themselves, make sure that the audio is working, and then they will say, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to bring up something you have never seen before, graph, extract of text, whatever it happens to be. And although it was particularly cool here because I gave almost no context about either the graph or the poem, you can in some cases literally just be expected to look at what's on the screen in front of you and then start talking about it. And that's one thing to be braced for. And the reason I quite like doing that is because lots of students kind of expect a nice 25-minute chat about their personal statement or about kind of topics they prepared for or topics they've discussed in their submitted written work. That's often not the case. Often the interviews are literally not mentioning your statement or your written work at all. They're just saying, okay, here's a piece of source material that we as interviewers have used with every single candidate we're interviewing. What can you make of it?
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Tom. Alison, how was that for you?
It was difficult. I think when we talk through feedback, you don't have to save my feelings because actually it would be helpful for us all to understand what was positive, but also what I would work on if I were a real candidate.
Sure. So we have maybe a minute or two to talk through feedback, because I want to give it at least an extract of the other two interviews as well. I think we've been a bit longer with this interview to give you an idea of the actual length of real Oxbridge interviews. So that was about 25 minutes, about how long you'd expect it to be, and it goes by really quickly, as Tom said. I think there were some really good things in that. And in reality, people who are being interviewed at Oxford and Cambridge, there's not a huge difference there's not a huge variation. Most people are pretty good. And that's what we hear from all the different former admissions tutors that we work with. Um, really good things Alison did was to take time to think. There was no, it didn't seem any forced pressure to jump into making inferences and all sorts of analytical points. So really took time to think. That enabled her to actually see what was in front of her. So with arts and humanities subjects, if you're given a source piece of source material, a graph, a piece of text or something, what's a really good way of approaching it is to make sure you really notice what's there and describe what's in front of you before trying to skip ahead and making complex points about what metaphors are coming out of it and what inferences you can make and analytical points. So she paid really good attention to what was there. And I think also a really good thing was when she was struggling a little bit with the English, with the poem in particular, which potentially was the weaker half of the interview, what she did well and what you can always do is lean into the uncertainty. So if there's something you're not sure about and you're finding it difficult to articulate, well, answer a question, then think, why am I finding this difficult? And start talking about that instead. Well, it's difficult because of the ambiguity of the language, or because I don't understand what this word means, or because of the way these ideas are connected together. And that can then bring more of a that can bring you to an interesting point, because that's something the interviewer can pick up on. But so I think it was not bad at all. I think the English side of it was probably slightly weaker than the history side of it. Um, and if you could do anything more, it could be to offer even more ideas about the piece of source material in front of you, even as basic as where are the full stops landing, what sorts of imagery is being used. So try to be as generous as possible with what things you're picking up. Okay, Tom, was there anything you wanted to add to that before we move on?
I think we can move on. It was pretty good,
Yep.
honestly, and it's just about being specific and precise to what's in front of you.
Cool. I think we have time for maybe 7 or 8 minutes as a snippet of each of these with a little bit of feedback at the end. So this next one, Alison is the interviewer, and I'm going to play a recording. We've tested this out. The audio quality should be good. Apologies if the video is a little bit
Hi, Simon. My name is
jumpy. I'm going to make sure that you can hear the sound. Yep, that should be coming
Alison. It's
through.
really nice to meet you.
Okay,
And
I'll mute
we'll
myself
have
now.
some time today for our interview for Cambridge Physical Natural Sciences. Just wanted to start off and ask you why you've applied for Physical Natural Sciences.
Yeah, hi Alison. Um, so I think I really like maths and physics in school. So I think I wanted to do something that kind of used maths and physics. And my family were quite keen for me to do engineering, but I thought that didn't sound too interesting. So I kind of decided to do physical natural sciences instead.
Okay, thank you. Let's try some problems then. My first question is to imagine that you're in a boat on a lake and you have a house brick with you in that boat. Then you drop the brick off the side of the boat and it sinks to the bottom of the lake. It's completely submerged. Um, what is the overall effect on the water level of the lake of that action?
So I think if you take the brick out of the boat, then the boat might move up a bit because it's not as heavy. So that might make the water level go down. But then when you put the brick in the water, it would then go back up, I think.
Do you think that the overall effect nets out? Is it that the water level remains constant?
Um, I'm not too sure. I know that when you put the brick back in the water, the amount of water that moves would be the same as the volume of the brick. But I'm not too sure how much the volume of the water will change when you take the brick out of the boat.
So when the brick is with you in the boat, how much water is it displacing? How would you work that out if you had all of the information available?
Yeah, so I think I need the weight of the brick, and that extra weight in the boat is what pushes down on the water and causes the level to rise slightly. So yeah, I think I need the weight of the brick.
So if you have that information available, the weight of the brick, how would you calculate how much water is displaced? What would the relationship be between the water displaced and certain characteristics of the brick? Because you said when it's submerged in water,
Yeah,
it's related to the volume of the brick.
yeah. So I'm not sure exactly how much water will be displaced, but I think it would be kind of proportional to the weight of the brick.
Mm-hmm. Proportional in what sense? It would be greater than, the same as?
Um, so maybe the weight of the water that is displaced would be the same as the weight of the brick. Would that be right?
Mm-hmm. Good.
Okay, so then if the weight of water displaced by the brick is the same as the weight of the brick, and then when it goes back in the water is proportional to the volume of the brick, then it depends on whether the volume of the brick is greater than the volume of water that weighs the same as the brick. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. And so can you use what you know about a normal household brick and the density of that
Yeah.
versus water?
So I guess a brick would sink. So we'd say it's more dense than water. And so that would mean that the weight of the brick would be equivalent to more water than the volume of the brick.
Good. So the effect on the water level would be?
So I think the water level would rise. Is that right?
So is there more or less water displaced in the original situation versus the second situation when that brick is submerged in the water?
There's more
Yeah,
water
I think we
displaced
could
in
do
that
we could do a
situation.
cut on the interview there. So the reason that we've done that is I think we've seen enough. So there's a good lot of information there to give some feedback on. And so what I really liked about Simon's approach there is the fact that he's quite persistent. So even though at times then he kind of lost track of the question, it's a very hard one to keep track of, these two situations with the brick in the boat and then the brick in the water. It is quite a confusing one. But he kept persisting and showed that very determined attitude, which is half the battle in a science interview. It was very much a back and forth, which is good. Some students are fearful that that means they've failed in some way if the interviewer has to offer a hint or a nudge. It might be that actually this is what the interviewer expects, and you're simulating what would really happen in a tutorial. I also asked the interviewee here why he wanted to study physical natural sciences. I put him on the spot, and I think there's a bit we can learn from his response there. He focused on the negative of not wanting to do engineering rather than actively wanting to do physical natural sciences. And if you do have the opportunity to talk about your motivation for the subject, it's your really one chance to vocalize why you care about your subject and what any of your special interests might be. So it may not come up, but if it does, make sure that you are prepared for that moment and have something positive and interesting to say.
Thank you, Alison. Tom, did you have anything to add about Simon's performance there?
I think the only real note I had there is the thing I tend to find with STEM interviews is that you have to work as fast as possible. So usually the interviewers will have a relatively standardized set of questions to pose interviewees, and the only constant is the amount of time each interviewee has, which might be 25 minutes. A really strong student posed with the brick on a boat question might get to the right answer very quickly, explain exactly what's happening, why the water level will be affected in a certain way within 45 seconds, move on to the next. And another interviewee might still get the right answer, but take 3 minutes to get there. And so a lot of it is working as quickly as possible, as accurately as possible, talking your way through crucially your thinking. So if you do go wrong, your interviewer can adjust and correct you, rather than just sitting in silence, getting the wrong answer, and then having to explain where you might have gone wrong after the fact and waste more time within this really narrow time window you have.
Yeah, I think that's really important, but it's, I suppose, not necessarily a test of who can get all the right answers the quickest. Sometimes I know that lots of successful STEM applicants spend a longer amount of time on a question that maybe they don't get quite right or they don't finish, but still are given a place because they're showing lots of teachability in answering that question. So, like you mentioned, you can work your way through a question really quickly. Great, you can go through more questions overall, but even if you get that question wrong, as long as you're explaining to the interviewers where your thinking is going and what sort of rules you're applying, what logical steps you're taking, they'll be able to take you down the right path eventually. And it shows that you're more teachable. Cool. So I am now going to show a snippet from our last mock interview for law, which is going to be led by one of our colleagues, Sadia, who is a Oxford Law graduate. Just to re-emphasize, this is being recorded and we're going to share the recording, but so are these 2 recorded interviews for physical natural sciences and law, also recorded. They're much longer than we can show, but we'll send them out to you afterwards as well. So if you'd like to watch the whole thing, you'll be able to. Okay, so I will start this off now, and I think we'll probably watch another 5 or 6 minutes of this one.
Okay, perfect. Hi, Edward. Nice to meet you. My name is Sadia, and I'll be interviewing you today. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm well. Have you had any other interviews yet, or is this your first one?
No, this is the first one.
Okay, so let's hope it's interesting. If you can see my screen, just making sure you can. Perfect. Yep. I have got a definition up for you, and this is the definition for murder or homicide. I'll give you a couple of moments to quickly just read through this, and once you're done, we can just have a little discussion about it.
Okay, great. I've had a look at that now. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. So kind of immediately, do you think there are any terms that need defining, or is there anything that has kind of struck you as something you want to discuss?
Yeah, so I'm interested by this phrase, the King's Peace. This isn't something that I've seen before. Other than that, I think I'm quite familiar with this as a definition.
Okay, perfect. So have a guess. What do you think the King's Peace would mean?
So I'm wondering whether this might be something to do with kind of the area of jurisdiction of the law. So it might be to do with kind of where the law applies. So for example, if it happens overseas, maybe it's not kind of within the domain of the British legal system. or maybe if it happens within warfare, for example, maybe that's outside of the king's peace. I'm looking at those two words, kings and peace, and kind of guessing what they might mean.
Yeah, and that's very logical of you. And your second kind of interpretation is closer there. So the King's Peace is essentially when we're not in a period of war, because of course then we have to use different definitions for what's considered acceptable in war. Perfect. Is there anything else here that you think needs defining? It doesn't necessarily have to be a term that you don't recognize, just a term that you think requires a definition for us to kind of work with going forward.
Okay, well, we might want to look at grievous, where it says grievous bodily harm. So that's going to be quite a sort of subjective idea. So we're going to need to have some kind of plan for dealing with this if it ever comes to a dispute where we have to say what is or what isn't grievous bodily harm. And I think intent as well. So it says he intends to kill. Again, intent's quite a subjective word. So if we're really going to prove murder, we're going to need to have discussions around this idea of intent.
Okay, so what would you kind of define grievous bodily harm as?
So it's put here alongside kill. And so I would assume it could be something where it's kind of within the same category. So maybe it has the potential to cause death. And then that would be a kind of less subjective thing. So if a doctor could say, for example, yes, under different circumstances, this could have caused someone to die. And then you could argue that that was grievous bodily harm if the injuries have the extent to which they could have caused death.
Okay, and what about intention? What's the kind of definition you want to go for there?
So this is a bit trickier. So I think we'd want to have something that, because obviously you can't see inside someone's mind, so you can't necessarily tell what, even if there is intention there, we need to have kind of a sort of proof of intention. So there needs to be some kind of evidence that there was a plan to commit this act. So I would say I think this is a difficult one to define specifically, but we can do it in terms of evidence. So in terms of kind of the things we can see, because we just can't get inside a person's head.
Yeah. Do you not think that's more to do with kind of the whole evidence process as opposed to having to be defined in the meaning of intention?
This is true. I just think that the defining intention in sort of these psychological terms is going to get so complicated that it basically becomes meaningless. So it needs to be grounded in some kind of sort of factual or evidential process. So if we make a distinction between kind of spur of the moment intent versus long-term intent versus someone who considered this as an option, but this wasn't their primary intention, trying to distinguish psychologically between all of those things is just going to be simply too challenging.
Great. I think that was enough to get us an idea. So moving on to our thoughts about that snippet from that interview, you could see it's over 30 minutes long. So if you are an applicant, especially a law applicant, then it will be good for you to watch that afterwards. Overall, my impression is Edward did really well in that interview. If that was a real interview, then I think the interviewers would be really impressed. And what's really important to note, especially for a subject like law or any social science, is the emphasis is not on your knowledge. So here you're not expected to come pre-prepared with knowledge of what mens rea means or actus reus or any of those Latin terms that pertain to the law. You may have come across them in your introductory reading, but what he does really well is have a determination to deal with what's in front of him and pick apart the definitions that he's presented with. And with law interviews, it's quite common to be given something like a definition of a law live during an interview. It could go on to to be different situations applied to those different definitions, and you could describe how that context is applied to, let's say, grievous bodily harm, or whether it would violate the law in front of you. That's a really common way that a law interview could work. Another way is you're given a piece of reading to look at before the interview starts. So I think that was a really strong snippet from an interview, and it'll be worth watching the rest of it. Tom, do you have any thoughts?
I agree with the main thing you were saying, which is that you are not necessarily expected to just know an enormous amount about whatever subject you're being interviewed for, because if you did, you wouldn't need to do a degree to spend 3 years of your life understanding more about that subject. They are always choosing for cleverness, analytical ability, critical thought over just the person who has kind of absorbed the most information and is ready to kind of info dump it in their interview. With things like law interviews, quite often it can be helpful to anchor the kind of the abstract or the potentially abstract points you're making in examples. So begin talking about why something might have a certain degree of intent behind it and why that might be difficult to judge, just to anchor in kind of hypothetical case studies your analysis. And then that gives you a foundation to tease out potential tensions, implications, and also something, if you get a little bit lost, to return to and use as an anchor point or a focus.
Great. So we're coming up to the end of the webinar for this evening. So we've got a few more minutes, and we thought it would be useful to end on each of our favorite tip for applicants preparing for Oxford and Cambridge interviews. So first up, we have Alison.
It's a bit of an obvious one, but I just really want to drive home the point that in the sciences, we always notice this direct relationship between those candidates who have done almost daily problem-solving practice and those who are successful. And it's about going beyond the syllabus. So seek out chemistry, physics, maths, Olympiad, whatever is relevant to you. Seek out question materials that don't just follow the formula of an A-level question, but they really test your problem-solving skill.
My top tip is embrace uncertainty. And the point here is that people who are academics or who are really keen on understanding complex problems don't find the world easy to understand. There's lots of different shades of grey, regardless of what course or academic area you're interested in. And showing that excites you and that you want to dig into that complexity, particularly with the social sciences, where there's lots of ambiguity in the answers that we reach, can show that you're a potentially really strong undergraduate student of the subject and could go on to be a strong academic as well if you chose to be. So embrace uncertainty. In school, you're not necessarily rewarded for embracing uncertainty, but when you get to university, especially in these discussions, supervisions, and tutorials, it's a valuable thing to be able to needle apart the nuances between different ideas. So that's my tip.
I think this is a little bit ironic when I was talking about how you have to maximize every second earlier and work fast and so on. But it is important, where helpful, to take your time. So an interview is a socially pressured situation. You are posed a question and then you feel the pressure kind of building and building to start talking as soon as possible. Way too many of the candidates I do mock interviews with just start talking about the first thing that comes into their head. And that can quite often be a little bit of a wasted opportunity. And they would deliver a much stronger response if they think it's helpful in the moment. They take 5-10 seconds just to gather their thoughts a little bit, work out what the kind of the true intent of a question might be, or work out what their strongest line of response might be from 2 or 3 different options, to perhaps begin just mentally structuring the answer they want to give before they then start to deliver it. And again, make sure that you're trying to impose a little bit of structure in responses, and also at the other end, don't ramble. So if you think you're going off topic, that's fine. You don't have to monologue for 2 minutes in response to every question. Cut yourself off. There'll always be another question.
And equally, if you've got multiple interviews and you feel like you've done a really bad job with your first one, A, you probably haven't, and B, move past it, think about the next one, and brush yourself off. So finally, a few things to finish on. We have a resource which we've prepared, which give you broad critical thinking types of questions arranged by different subject area. So if you scan that QR code on the right, you'll be taken to that. A reminder of your 10% discount for coming to this webinar, webinar 0511. If you quote that in an email or on the phone, or if you use it on our website to purchase any mock interviews, you'll be given 10% discount from that. After this webinar, once you've exited, you'll be taken to a feedback survey where you'll be able to indicate how helpful you found this. But crucially, there's also a box for you to ask any questions you want to. So if you've got specific questions, I saw quite a number of questions coming through the Q&A. And the best way for us to approach these questions is by getting in contact with you after this webinar so that we can have a more in-depth discussion. So if you want to know what sorts of interview questions they might ask for archaeology and anthropology, or if you're not sure whether you're able to use a pen and paper for your interview for human sciences or whatever it might be, put your question into that box. Please share your comments with us and we'll be in touch with you as soon as possible. But have a wonderful rest of your evenings and thank you very much for sharing some of it with us. I hope you found that helpful and hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.